The moment I stepped into the hospital, I knew this night would be different. The air felt heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. Little did I know, my Friday the 13th night shift would become a nightmare I'd never forget. I've worked at Pinewood General for 5 years now, but I'd never seen the halls so eerily quiet. My footsteps echoed off the worn linoleum as I made my way to the nurse's station. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting strange shadows that seemed to dance just out of sight. "Evening, Carol." I called out to the day shift nurse. No response. Odd. Carol was always chatty, eager to fill me in on the day's events. I rounded the corner to find an empty chair. Carol's coat still draped over the back. A chill ran down my spine. Where was everyone? I checked the patient board. Only 4 names listed for our floor tonight. Mr. Jenkins in 301, Mrs. Rodriguez in 305, John Doe in 307, and MS. Thompson in 310. A light night, but that didn't explain the eerie silence. I pulled out my phone to check the time, 11:58 p.m. My shift had officially started, but something felt off. I tried to shake the feeling as I began my rounds. Mr. Jenkins was first. I knocked softly and entered his room. The old man was asleep, his wrinkled face peaceful in the dim light. I checked his vitals, all normal. As I turned to leave, I could have sworn I saw a shadow move in the corner of the room. I blinked, and it was gone. My heart raced as I stepped back into the hallway. Get it together, I told myself. It's just another night shift. But it wasn't. As I approached Mrs. Rodriguez's room, I heard whimpering. I quickened my pace, pushing open the door to find the elderly woman huddled in the corner, her eyes wide with fear. "Mrs. Rodriguez," I asked softly, approaching her slowly. "What's wrong?" She pointed a shaking finger towards a window. "They're coming," she whispered. "Can't you see them?" I turned to look, but saw only darkness beyond the glass. When I turned back, Mrs. Rodriguez had somehow returned to her bed, fast asleep as if nothing had happened. My hands trembled as I checked her vitals. Everything was normal, but how had she moved so quickly? And what had she seen? I practically ran to room 307, desperate to find some sense of normalcy. John Doe was a car accident victim, still unidentified and in a coma. He'd be exactly where we left him, peaceful and unchanging. I was wrong. As I entered the room, John Doe's eyes snapped open. He sat up rigidly, turning his head to face me with an unnatural slowness. His eyes were pitch black, empty voids that seemed to draw me in. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice a rasping whisper that couldn't possibly have come from his throat. "None of you should be here." I stumbled backwards, slamming the door shut. My heart pounded in my chest as I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. This couldn't be happening. Coma patients don't just wake up like that. And his eyes. A scream pierced the air, snapping me back to reality. MS. Thompson. I sprinted down the hall, bursting into room 310. MS. Thompson was thrashing in her bed, her arms flailing against invisible assailants. MS. Thompson. I cried, rushing to her side. "It's okay, you're safe." As I reached for her hand clamped around my wrist with surprising strength. She pulled me close, her eyes wild with panic. "They're here," she hissed. "In the walls, in the floors. Can't you hear them? They're coming for us all." I tried to pull away, but her grip was like iron. MS. Thompson, please, you need to calm down. There's nothing in the walls. But even as I said it, I heard it, a faint scratching sound, like nails on wood, coming from inside the walls. It grew louder, surrounding us, a cacophony of scraping and clawing that set my teeth on edge. MS. Thompson let out another piercing scream, releasing my wrist to cover her ears. I stumbled back, my own hands itching to block out the horrible sound. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. MS. Thompson had fallen back onto her pillows, her chest rising and falling rapidly. I checked her vitals with shaking hands, elevated heart rate, but otherwise stable. I needed help. Whatever was happening, I couldn't handle it alone. I rushed back to the nurse's station, reaching for the phone to call security. Dead. No dial tone. My cell phone. I fumbled it out of my pocket, but there was no signal. How was that possible? We always had reception here. A glance at the clock stopped me cold. 3:33 a.m. That couldn't be right. I'd only started my rounds a few minutes ago, hadn't I? The lights flickered, plunging the hall into darkness for a heart-stopping moment before humming back to life. In that brief second of blackness, I could have sworn I saw figures standing in the hallway, tall, impossibly thin shadows with gleaming eyes. I blinked, and they were gone. This isn't real, I told myself. I'm dreaming. I must have fallen asleep at the nurse's station. Any minute now, Carol will shake me awake, laughing at me for dozing off. But the pinch I gave myself hurt, and I didn't wake up. A low moan echoed down the hallway, snapping me out of my thoughts. It was coming from Mr. Jenkins' room. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of this hospital and never look back. But I was a nurse. These were my patients. I had to help them. I inched down the hallway, the moaning growing louder with each step. I pushed open Mr. Jenkins' door, steeling myself for whatever horror awaited me. Mr. Jenkins was hovering 3 feet above his bed, his body contorted at impossible angles. His eyes were open wide, rolled back in his head to show only the whites. The moaning was coming from him, a sound of pure anguish that made my soul ache. Mr. Jenkins, I whispered, my voice cracking. His head snapped towards me, bones cracking as it turned far beyond what should have been possible. When he spoke, it wasn't his voice, but a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Why did you come here? This night is not for the living. I backed away, my back hitting the wall. What's happening? What are you? The thing that wasn't Mr. Jenkins smiled, his mouth stretching impossibly wide. We are the forgotten, the ones who died in these halls, alone and afraid. And now you will join us. The lights went out. In the darkness, I felt cold hands grabbing at me, pulling me in all directions. I screamed, thrashing against their grip, but there were too many. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me, drowning out my cries for help. Just when I thought it was over, that I would be torn apart by these unseen forces, a warm light began to glow. It started faint, but grew brighter, pushing back the darkness and the grasping hands. I found myself back in the hallway, the hospital lights shining normally above me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I looked around, trying to make sense of what had happened. Nurse Davis, a voice called out. I spun around to see DR. Evans walking towards me, a concerned look on his face. Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost. I opened my mouth to respond, to tell him everything that had happened, but no words came out. How could I explain the impossible things I'd witnessed? DR. Evans put a hand on my shoulder, his touch reassuringly solid and real. Why don't you take a break? You've been on your feet all night. All night? I glanced at the clock, 6:45 a.m. My shift was almost over. As if in a daze, I let DR. Evans lead me to the break room. The morning sun was starting to peek through the windows, chasing away the last shadows of the night. I sank into a chair, my mind reeling. Had it all been a hallucination? Some sort of waking nightmare brought on by stress and lack of sleep? But as I raised my hand to brush my hair back, I saw them. Dark bruises circling my wrists were MS. Thompson had grabbed me, and there, just visible under the sleeve of my scrubs, were scratches from those unseen hands in the darkness. It had been real. All of it. I looked up at DR. Evans, who was watching me with a mixture of concern and Something else. Understanding? Doctor, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. What happened last night? He sighed, taking the seat across from me. Nurse Davis, how much do you know about the history of this hospital? As he began to speak, I realized my night of terror was only the beginning. The true story of Pinewood General was far more horrifying than I could have imagined, and I was now a part of it. I never looked at Friday the 13th the same way again. The moment I stepped onto that train, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake, but it was too late. The doors hissed shut behind me, sealing my fate. As we plunged into the tunnel, I realized this wouldn't be just another late-night commute. This was a one-way trip into darkness. It had been a long day at the office. By the time I finished my project, the building was nearly empty. I rushed out into the night, cursing under my breath as I felt the first drops of rain. Perfect, just perfect. The station was eerily quiet as I descended the steps, my footsteps echoing off the tiled walls. I checked my watch, 11:58 p.m. The last train was due any minute. If I missed it, I'd be stuck here all night. A rumble in the distance. Headlights appeared in the tunnel, growing brighter as the train approached. I let out a sigh of relief. Made it. The train screeched to a halt, the doors sliding open with a pneumatic hiss. I hesitated for a moment, peering into the car. It was empty, save for a single passenger at the far end. A figure hunched over in a heavy coat, face hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. Something about the scene made my skin crawl, but I shook off the feeling. It was just my imagination, fueled by too much caffeine and too little sleep. I stepped aboard, the doors closing behind me with a finality that made my stomach lurch. As the train lurched forward, I grabbed a pole to steady myself. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting strange shadows that seemed to dance just at the edge of my vision. I tried to focus on my reflection in the window, but all I could see was darkness rushing past. We entered the tunnel, and the world outside disappeared. The only sound was the rhythmic clacking of wheels on tracks, punctuated by the occasional creak and groan of metal. I found myself straining to hear anything else, a cough, a rustle of clothing, any sign of life from the other passenger. Nothing. I glanced down the car, trying to get a better look at my fellow traveler. They hadn't moved since I boarded, still hunched over in the same position. Were they asleep? Drunk? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. The train swayed, and I stumbled, nearly losing my grip on the pole. As I steadied myself, I noticed something odd about the windows. They seemed darker somehow, not just the absence of light from outside, but as if the glass itself was absorbing what little illumination there was in the car. I blinked, and for a split second, I could have sworn I saw faces pressing against the glass on the outside. Pale, distorted visages with empty black eyes and gaping mouths. I jerked back, my heart racing. When I looked again, there was nothing but my own pale reflection staring back at me. Get a grip, I told myself. It's just your imagination playing tricks on you. You're tired, that's all. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I needed a distraction. I fumbled for my phone, desperate for some connection to the outside world. No signal. Of course. We were deep underground by now. How long had we been traveling? It felt like hours, but that couldn't be right. The trip from my office to my stop usually took 20 minutes, 30 at most. I checked my watch, but the face was blank. Dead battery? I could have sworn it was working earlier. A sudden lurch sent me staggering. The lights flickered, plunging the car into darkness for a heart-stopping moment before sputtering back to life. In that brief instant of blackness, I heard something, a whisper, so faint I might have imagined it, but it made my blood run cold. Join us. The light stabilized, and I found myself gripping the pole so tightly my knuckles had turned white. My eyes darted around the car, searching for the source of the voice. The other passenger hadn't moved. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. This was ridiculous. I was letting my imagination run wild. There was a perfectly reasonable explanation for everything that was happening, wasn't there? I decided to confront my fears head-on. I'd walk down to the other end of the car, talk to the mysterious passenger. They were probably just some poor soul who'd had too much to drink and missed their stop. We'd share a laugh about how creepy the subway can be late at night, and everything would be fine. Each step down the aisle felt like walking through molasses. The air seemed to thicken, resisting my progress. The fluorescent lights buzzed angrily overhead, casting stark shadows that seemed to reach for me as I passed. Halfway down the car, I froze. Something was wrong with the windows. The glass had taken on a liquid quality, rippling and distorting like the surface of a pond. And in those ripples, I saw things. Flashes of places that couldn't possibly exist. Alien landscapes, crumbling ruins of impossible cities, vast empty spaces that hurt my eyes to look at. I tore my gaze away, focusing on the passenger ahead. Just a few more steps. I could do this. As I drew closer, I noticed something odd about the figure. Their coat seemed to shift and writhe, as if it wasn't made of fabric at all, but something alive. The brim of their hat dipped lower, obscuring any hint of a face. "Excuse me," I said, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the oppressive silence. "Are you all right?" No response. I reached out, my hand trembling, and tapped the figure on the shoulder. "Hey, are you?" The coat collapsed empty. The hat fell to the floor with a soft thump. I stumbled back, a scream caught in my throat. This wasn't possible. There had been someone there. I'd seen them. A laugh echoed through the car, a sound of pure malice that made my soul shrivel. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, the walls, the floor, the very air around me. "Poor little lamb." The voice crooned, the same whisper I'd heard before, but louder now. Clearer. So lost. So alone. But don't worry. You'll never be alone again. The lights went out. In the darkness, I felt something brush against my leg. Cold, clammy fingers grasped at my ankles. I screamed then, kicking out blindly as I scrambled backwards. My back hit the door at the end of the car, and I fumbled for the handle. Locked. Pale light began to fill the car, but it wasn't coming from the fluorescent tubes overhead. It emanated from the windows, a sickly glow that revealed horrors beyond imagination. The glass had melted away entirely now, leaving gaping holes that opened onto somewhere else. Twisted landscapes stretched into infinity, populated by things that should not be. And they were reaching for me, countless arms extending from those impossible spaces, grasping and clawing. "No more stops," the voice whispered, now seeming to come from inside my own head. "No more stations, just the endless ride. Join us. Become one with the night." I pressed myself against the door, trying to put as much distance between myself and those reaching arms as possible. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a dream, a hallucination, anything but real. But I could feel those cold fingers brushing against my skin, leaving trails of ice in their wake. The air grew thick, making it hard to breathe. My vision began to darken around the edges. This was it. This was how it ended. Swallowed by the night, lost forever on a train that never stopped. Just as I felt myself slipping away, a new sound cut through the madness. A horn, loud, clear, and blessedly familiar. Light flooded the car, harsh and bright. I blinked, momentarily blinded. When my vision cleared, I found myself staring at a station platform. People were boarding the train, chatting and laughing as if nothing was amiss. I looked around wildly. The windows were normal. The lights were on. There was no sign of the horrors I'd witnessed. Had it all been a dream? As passengers filled the car, I noticed my reflection in the now solid glass. My face was pale, my eyes wide with lingering fear, and there, just visible at the collar of my shirt, was a mark. A single, perfect handprint, stark against my skin. The doors began to close. In that moment, I had to make a choice. Stay on the train and risk facing those horrors again, or step off into the unknown. I chose the unknown. I burst through the closing doors, nearly knocking over a startled commuter. I didn't stop running until I was above ground, gulping in the cool night air like a drowning man. I never took the last train again. Some nights, I still hear that whisper in my dreams, calling me back to the endless ride. But now I know the truth. Some journeys are one-way trips, and some destinations are best left unreached. So if you ever find yourself rushing for that last train on a stormy night, take my advice. Wait for morning. It's better to be late than to never arrive at all. The moment I set foot in that house, I knew something was off. The air felt heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. But I needed the money, and it was just one night. How bad could it be? If only I'd known then what horrors awaited me in that seemingly perfect suburban home. It was supposed to be an easy gig. The Millers were new to the neighborhood, and word had spread that they were looking for a reliable babysitter. As a college student always short on cash, I jumped at the opportunity. Friday the 13th wasn't exactly my ideal night to start a new job, but beggars can't be choosers. I remember standing on their porch, taking in the immaculate facade of the two-story colonial. Everything looked picture-perfect, from the manicured lawn to the gleaming brass knocker. Yet something made me hesitate before ringing the bell. A chill ran down my spine, and for a split second, I could have sworn I saw a face in the upstairs window, pale, with dark, hollow eyes. I blinked, and it was gone. Mrs. Miller answered the door with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You must be Sarah," she said, ushering me inside. "We're so glad you could make it on such short notice." The interior of the house was just as pristine as the outside, almost unnaturally so. Not a speck of dust, not a toy out of place. It felt more like a museum than a home with two young children. "The kids are already in bed," Mr. Miller explained, appearing from the living room. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a suit that seemed a bit formal for a night out. "They're sound sleepers, so you shouldn't have any trouble. We'll be back around midnight." Mrs. Miller handed me a list of emergency numbers and instructions. Her hand brushed mine as she did, and I had to suppress a shudder. Her skin was ice cold. "One last thing," she added, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Whatever you do, don't go into the attic. It's under renovation. Wouldn't want you to hurt yourself up there." Before I could respond, they were out the door, leaving me alone in the silent house. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. "It's just babysitting," I told myself. "You've done this 100 times." I decided to check on the kids, just to ease my mind. The upper floor was dark, the hallway stretching out before me like the maw of some great beast. As I approached the first bedroom, a floorboard creaked under my foot. The sound echoed in the silence, making me jump. The door to the children's room was ajar. I peeked inside, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. Two small forms were visible under the covers, their chests rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. Normal, peaceful. I let out a sigh of relief and turned to head back downstairs. That's when I heard it, a soft thump coming from above, the attic. My heart began to race. It was probably nothing, an old house settling, maybe a squirrel on the roof. But Mrs. Miller's warning echoed in my mind. "Don't go into the attic." I hurried back downstairs, trying to distract myself. I flipped on the TV, but every channel was nothing but static. Weird. The Millers seemed like the type to have the latest cable package. I tried the radio next, but got the same result, just a sea of white noise. Another thump from upstairs, louder this time, followed by what sounded like scratching. "Hello," I called out, immediately regretting it. What if someone was up there? What if I had just alerted them to my presence? Silence fell again, heavy and oppressive. I stood perfectly still, straining my ears for any sound. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then a giggle, high-pitched and childlike, but with an undercurrent that made my skin crawl. It was coming from the kids' room. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my heart pounding in my chest. The children had been asleep. I'd seen them myself. So, I burst into the bedroom, flipping on the light switch. The beds were empty, covers thrown back as if the occupants had left in a hurry. But that was impossible. I'd have heard them come downstairs. "Hello." I called again, my voice shaking. "Kids, this isn't funny. Come out now." Another giggle, this time from the hallway. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the open attic hatch at the end of the hall, a pull cord dangling invitingly. Don't go into the attic. But what choice did I have? The kids were missing, and that's where the sound had come from. I had to find them. With trembling hands, I grasped the cord and pulled. The ladder creaked as it descended, revealing a rectangle of pitch darkness above. The giggles were louder now, accompanied by the patter of small feet. I took a deep breath and began to climb. The attic was a cavernous space, the air thick with dust and the musty smell of age. Moonlight filtered through a small window, casting long shadows across piles of boxes and old furniture. And there, in the far corner, were 2 small figures. Thank God. I breathed, relief washing over me. You scared me half to death. Come on, let's get you back to bed. But as I approached, I realized something was wrong. The children weren't moving, their backs to me as they stood unnaturally still. "Kids," I reached out to touch one's shoulder. They turned, and I screamed. Their faces were wrong. Pale, sunken, with black pits where their eyes should have been. Their mouths stretched into impossibly wide grins, filled with needle-sharp teeth. "Want to play?" they asked in unison, their voices a horrifying blend of childish glee and inhuman malice. I scrambled backwards, tripping over a box and crashing to the floor. The things that weren't children advanced, moving with a jerky, puppet-like gait. "You shouldn't have come up here," they said. "But now that you're here, you can stay forever, just like us." My back hit the wall. There was nowhere left to run. I closed my eyes, bracing for whatever horror was about to befall me. But instead of cold, dead hands, I felt a warm touch on my arm. I opened my eyes to find a young woman kneeling beside me. She was pale and translucent, glowing faintly in the darkness. "You need to get out of here," she said urgently. "Now, before it's too late." I looked past her. The monstrous children were frozen in place, as if time had stopped for everything but me and this ghostly woman. "Who? What are you?" I managed to stammer. "I was like you once," she said, sadness etched across her ethereal features. "A babysitter?" I didn't listen to the warning. I came up here, and, well, you can see the result. "The Millers," I whispered, realization dawning. "They're not really." She shook her head. "They haven't been human for a very long time. This house, it's a trap. It lures in innocent souls, feeds on them. Those children, they were its first victims, decades ago. Now they help it claim more. How do I stop it?" "You can't," she said. "Not alone. But you can escape. There's still time, but you have to go now. I'll hold them off as long as I can." Before I could respond, she stood and turned to face the frozen monstrosities. They began to move again, slowly at first, then faster as they realized something was interfering with their hunt. "Run!" the ghost woman shouted. I didn't need to be told twice. I scrambled down the ladder, taking the stairs 3 at a time as inhuman shrieks echoed from the attic. I could hear the thunder of small feet behind me, getting closer with each passing second. I reached the front door and yanked it open, only to find myself face to face with the Millers. Their eyes were black voids, their mouths stretched into those same terrible grins. "Leaving so soon?" "Mr. Miller asked, his voice a guttural growl. "But the fun's just beginning." I ducked under his grasping arms and ran. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly, not daring to look back. I didn't stop until I reached the police station, bursting through the doors and collapsing at the feet of a startled officer. They didn't believe me, of course. When they went to investigate, they found nothing but an empty, abandoned house. No sign of the Millers, no monstrous children, no ghostly babysitter. Just decade-old real estate listings for a property that had never sold. I tried to put that night behind me, to convince myself it had all been some sort of stress-induced hallucination. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear those giggles. And when I pass a mirror, I catch a glimpse of a pale figure standing behind me, warning me with her eyes to keep running. So if you're ever asked to babysit at a Too Perfect house on Friday the 13th, take my advice, say no. Some jobs aren't worth any amount of money, and some houses are hungry for more than just a night's entertainment. The trees whispered secrets that night, secrets I wish I'd never heard. As I sit here, the lone survivor of our ill-fated camping trip, I can't help but wonder, if we'd noticed the signs earlier, would any of us have made it out alive? The forest doesn't give up its victims easily, and on Friday the 13th, it was particularly hungry. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway. Just 4 friends escaping the city for some fresh air and stargazing. Mark, our self-proclaimed outdoorsman, had discovered this hidden gem of a campsite online. Off the beaten path, he said. Unspoiled nature. No crowds. No witnesses, as it turned out. We arrived late Friday afternoon, the sun already dipping below the tree line as we unloaded our gear. The forest pressed in close around the small clearing, ancient pines towering overhead like silent sentinels. "Check it out, guys," Mark called, pointing to a tree near the edge of our campsite. Weird markings, maybe from a bear? We gathered around, peering at the deep gouges in the bark. They didn't look like any bear claw marks I'd ever seen. The cuts were too precise, almost geometric in their pattern. "I don't like this," Sarah muttered, wrapping her arms around herself. "It feels like we're being watched." "Don't be silly," Mark laughed, though I noticed he glanced nervously over his shoulder. "It's just nature. Come on, let's get the tent set up before it gets dark." As we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah was right. The forest seemed too quiet. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just the whisper of wind through the leaves, almost like hushed voices just beyond the range of hearing. By the time we had our camp established, night had fallen. We gathered around the fire, roasting marshmallows and trading ghost stories. Typical camping fare, but there was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there at the start of our trip. "Did you guys hear that?" Alex asked suddenly. Sitting up straight, we fell silent, straining our ears. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, faintly, a sound drifted through the trees. A low, rhythmic thumping, like a massive heartbeat. "Probably just some kids at another campsite," Mark said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Music or something." "There aren't any other campsites for miles," Sarah pointed out. "You said so yourself." The sound faded away, leaving us in uneasy silence. We tried to recapture the light-hearted mood from earlier, but our laughter felt forced, our smiles strained. As we prepared to turn in for the night, I noticed more of those strange markings on the trees surrounding our camp. Had they been there before? I could have sworn the clearing was smaller now, the forest pressing in closer. "Guys," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "maybe we should pack up and leave. This place, it doesn't feel right." "Don't be ridiculous," Mark scoffed, but I could see the fear in his eyes. "We can't drive back in the dark. We'll leave first thing in the morning, okay?" Reluctantly, we retreated to our tents. I lay awake for hours, listening to the forest. The wind had picked up, and now the whispers in the trees seemed clearer, almost like words in a language just beyond my understanding. I must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a scream. Sarah's scream. I scrambled out of my tent, heart pounding. The clearing was bathed in pale moonlight, casting long shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Sarah stood at the edge of the campsite, pointing into the darkness between the trees. "There's something out there," she cried. I saw eyes, so many eyes. Mark and Alex emerged from their tents, looking rumpled and confused. "What's going on?" Mark demanded. Before Sarah could answer, a twig snapped in the forest. We all whirled toward the sound. There, just beyond the firelight, I caught a glimpse of movement. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, slipped between the trees. "Hello," Alex called out, his voice shaking. "Is someone there?" Silence. Then, that rhythmic thumping again, louder now. It seemed to come from all around us, the very ground vibrating with each beat. "We need to leave," I said, already moving to break down my tent. "Now!" No one argued this time. We scrambled to pack up our gear, casting fearful glances into the surrounding darkness. The whispers in the trees had grown louder, more insistent. I could almost make out words now. "Join us, stay with us, become one with the forest." We were nearly finished when Alex let out a strangled cry. I turned to see him staring at his hands in horror. Roots were growing from his fingertips, burrowing into the earth. "Help me," he pleaded, trying to pull free. But the roots only grew faster, thickening and spreading up his arms. Sarah screamed again, and I saw she was in the same predicament. Roots burst from the ground, wrapping around her legs and pulling her down. "Mark," I shouted, reaching for my friend, but he was already changing, his skin taking on the texture of bark, branches sprouting from his shoulders. I watched in helpless horror as my friends were consumed by the forest, their bodies twisting and reshaping until they were indistinguishable from the surrounding trees. Their screams faded into the ever-present whispers of the woods. Panic overtook me. I ran, abandoning our gear and my transformed friends. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, roots trying to trip me with every step. The forest was alive around me, grasping and clawing. I don't know how long I ran. Hours, maybe. The moon tracked across the sky, casting shifting shadows that seemed to chase me through the trees. More than once, I caught glimpses of those tall, thin figures keeping pace with me just out of clear sight. As dawn broke, I finally burst out of the tree-line onto a road. A car screeched to a halt in front of me, the driver leaning out with a concerned expression. "Are you okay?" he asked, taking in my wild appearance and bloodstreaked face. I couldn't find the words to explain what had happened. I simply shook my head and croaked out, "Help." The authorities searched the forest, of course. They found our campsite, our abandoned gear strewn about as if we'd left in a hurry. But of my friends, there was no sign. The official report ruled it a tragic case of hikers getting lost in the woods. But I know the truth. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear those whispers. I see faces in the knots of trees, familiar eyes peering out from behind wooden masks. And when the wind blows just right, I can almost make out their voices, calling me to join them. I don't go camping anymore. I avoid parks, stay away from houseplants. Because now I know the truth. The forest is always hungry, always watching. And on certain nights, when the moon is full and the stars align just right, it reaches out to claim new victims. So if you're planning a camping trip, especially on a Friday the 13th, take my advice. Stay home. Some parts of nature aren't meant for human eyes, and some forests would rather keep you forever than let you leave. As for me, I'm moving to the desert. Let's see the trees try to get me there. But even as I pack my bags, I can't shake the feeling that it's already too late. This morning, I found a small sprout growing from my palm. By noon, it had grown into a twig, and now, as the sun sets, I swear I can hear leaves rustling beneath my skin. The forest isn't done with me yet, and I fear that soon, very soon, I'll be joining my friends after all. Because once the forest chooses you, there's no escape. It's only a matter of time before we all return to the trees. So remember my story. And the next time you're in the woods and you hear a whisper on the wind, run. Run and don't look back. Because it might just be me or what's left of me, trying to warn you before it's too late. The forest is calling. And sooner or later, we all must answer. The fog came out of nowhere, thick as cotton and twice as suffocating. One moment I was cruising down the familiar highway, and the next I was lost in a world of white. Little did I know that wrong turn would lead me down a road from which there might be no return. It had been a long day at the office. By the time I finally shut down my computer and grabbed my keys, the building was nearly empty. I glanced at my watch as I hurried to the parking garage. 11:45 p.m. Great. Sarah was going to kill me for missing dinner. Again. As I pulled out onto the street, I noticed the date on my dashboard. Friday, September 13th. I'm not usually superstitious, but something about that combination made me uneasy. I shook off the feeling and merged onto the highway, hoping to make up some time on the drive home. The first tendrils of fog appeared about 20 minutes into my journey. At first, it was just wisps curling across the road. Nothing to worry about, but it thickened rapidly until I could barely see 10 feet in front of my car. I slowed down, squinting through the windshield. The fog seemed to swallow my headlights, reflecting the beams back at me in a disorienting glare. I couldn't even make out the road signs anymore. That's when I missed my exit. By the time I realized my mistake, it was too late to turn back. I figured I'd just take the next exit and backtrack. No big deal, right? Wrong. The next exit never came. The highway stretched on endlessly, swallowed by the mist. My GPS was going haywire, the screen flickering between signal lost and impossible locations. According to the map, I was somehow in the middle of the ocean. An hour passed, then two. The fog never lifted, and I never saw another car. Just an endless ribbon of asphalt disappearing into white nothingness. My fuel gauge was dipping dangerously low when I finally saw a sign looming out of the mist. Exit the teen. Welcome to Shadowvale. Last stop for 100 miles. I'd never heard of Shadowvale, but at this point, any exit was better than none. I took the ramp, relief washing over me as I imagined finding a gas station and someone who could give me directions. The exit ramp curved sharply, descending into a valley I hadn't realized was there. As I drove, the fog began to thin, revealing glimpses of my surroundings. What I saw made me wish for the blindness of the mist. The trees lining the road were wrong, their trunks twisted into impossible shapes, branches reaching out like grasping fingers. In the gaps between them, I caught flashes of movement, dark shapes darting just out of sight. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. This couldn't be real. I was tired, that's all. My mind was playing tricks on me. Then I saw the figure in the road. It was humanoid, but too tall, too thin to be human. It stood perfectly still in the center of my lane, face hidden by the shadows. I slammed on the brakes, tires screeching as I swerved to avoid it. My car fishtailed, spinning off the road and into the ditch. The last thing I saw before my head hit the steering wheel was the figure turning to face me, revealing a blank expanse where its face should have been. I don't know how long I was out. When I came to, my head was throbbing and there was a trickle of blood running down my face. The car was dead, but somehow the headlights were still on, cutting twin beams through the mist. And there, illuminated in the glare, was the figure from the road. It stood just beyond the reach of the headlights, its elongated body swaying slightly as if moved by an unfelt breeze. As I watched, frozen in terror, it took a step forward, then another. I fumbled with my seatbelt, finally freeing myself and scrambling out of the car. The chilly night air hit me like a slap, clearing some of the fog from my mind. I looked back at the figure, but it was gone. In the distance, I could see lights. A town, maybe? It seemed like my only option. I started walking, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The shadows between the trees seemed darker now, alive with movement. As I walked, I began to notice things along the road. Discarded personal items, a child's teddy bear, a single shoe, a cracked smartphone. All showed signs of age, as if they'd been there for years. How many others had taken this exit and never left? The grip of panic tightened around my chest. I quickened my pace, almost running now. The lights were getting closer, resolving into the shapes of buildings. But something was off about them. The architecture was all wrong, a mishmash of styles from different eras. Some of the structures seemed to defy the laws of physics, with impossible angles and floors that didn't line up. I reached the outskirts of town, my relief at finding civilization quickly turning to dread. The streets were empty, devoid of both people and cars. Every window was dark. The only illumination came from old-fashioned street lamps that flickered and buzzed, casting long shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. A sign caught my eye. Shadowvale Gas and Grocery, open 24 hours salvation. I could use their phone, call for help. I jogged towards the store, hope rising in my chest. It died as soon as I reached the entrance. The windows were covered in a thick layer of dust, obscuring the interior. But pressed against the glass were handprints, dozens of them, overlapping in a frantic pattern, as if people had been trying desperately to get out. I backed away, my heart pounding. This was wrong. All of it was wrong. A sound behind me made me whirl around. There, at the end of the street, was the figure I'd seen on the road. No longer alone. It was joined by others, a whole crowd of impossibly tall, impossibly thin shapes. And they were all facing me. I ran. I tore through the twisted streets of Shadowvale, the sound of my pounding footsteps echoing off the warped buildings. I could hear them behind me, not running, but moving with a smooth, gliding pace that somehow kept up no matter how fast I fled. I turned a corner and found myself in a town square. In the center stood a statue, its features obscured by tendrils of mist. But as I drew closer, the fog parted, revealing a familiar face. It was me. The statue depicted me, down to the smallest detail, frozen in an expression of abject terror. At its base was a plaque. In memory of those who found Shadowvale, may they never leave. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This place, this town, it wasn't just lost. It was a trap, a hunting ground for things that should not exist. I spun around, looking for an escape route, but the figures had caught up. They formed a circle around me, their blank faces turned in my direction. Slowly, inexorably, they began to close in. In desperation, I closed my eyes and thought of home, of Sarah waiting for me, of the life I'd left behind when I took that cursed exit. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my car. The fog was gone. I was on the highway, right where I'd been before I missed my exit. My GPS showed the correct location, and my fuel gauge was full. Had it all been a dream? Some kind of stress-induced hallucination? I made it home safely that night, collapsing into bed beside a sleeping Sarah. I told myself it wasn't real, that I just dozed off at the wheel for a moment. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whisper of mist against my window. I see tall, thin shadows at the edge of my vision. And when I drive past that stretch of highway, I swear I can see an exit sign looming in the distance. Exit 13, welcome to old Shadowvale. I never take that exit. I never will. But I know it's out there, waiting. And I can't help but wonder how many others have found their way to that lonely road. How many have joined the silent residents of Shadowvale, trapped forever in a place that should not exist. So if you're driving late one night and the fog rolls in thick and heavy, take my advice. Stay on the main road. No matter what you see, no matter how lost you feel, don't take exit 13. Because Shadowvale is always waiting, always hungry for new visitors. And once you enter, you might never leave.